Welcome to Theology on the Rocks. Here we're going to talk a bit about suffering once more. But before we do that, cheers.
Prost.
So we have talked about suffering in general a little bit while we were still back at home, at my home. But now we're out in the dark bushveld with a fire at least in front of us, keeping the elephants and the hippos away. And yeah, with this darkness around us, we thought we could discuss suffering that's happening around us as well. And Pierre, you have a wonderful story that you shared with me that I want to hear again, please.
Wonderful, Tristan. Yeah, we thought we were going to start with a bit of name dropping. So it's a story from Dostoevsky, Fyodor Mikhailovich Dostoevsky, who wrote, I believe it was his first novel, a book titled Poor and Miserable Folk.
Mm-hmm.
And why I want to start with this story is because Dostoevsky has, I think, one hell of a talent of really touching on the nerves of life. You know, not playing around on the surface or just poking here and there, but he really touches on the rawness of life when he describes the lives of characters in his novels. And in Poor and Miserable Folk, I think he does this very well. Just perhaps as short intro, this would then still be an elaboration on our second question regarding how do we suffer. I think these stories put it very concretely. It doesn't allow us to abstract it and to keep it in the distance. It gives it faces. So this story, Poor and Miserable Folk, is about two people living in Imperial Russia at a time shortly after serfdom had been abolished, and there were a great many peasants who were living in extreme poverty. And as it was, I believe the story, I'm talking from memory now, but I believe the story plays out either in St. Petersburg or in Moscow, in a business district of town, where you have two main characters. So the whole book consists of these two characters writing letters to one another. That's all it is. And as it begins, you quickly realize that there are two main characters involved. The one is an elderly man who serves in the civil administration, but he's got a very low clerical job, copying documents mostly. He's got a long-standing drinking problem and probably has seen quite a bit of hardship in life. The other is an old lady, quite a few years younger than the old man, who lives opposite him. I'll describe their living conditions in a second. Who also finds herself at well past the prime of her life, as of yet unmarried, and accordingly with little to no prospects in life. Also coming out of an immediate history of rather intense family suffering. And so these two people of very, very meager economic means do not rent a room in a big hostel or apartment block type setting, but rather little rooms the size of cupboards. Dostoevsky describes it beautifully that as you enter, you get the impression that it is a room, but upon a second glance, you realize that it is only a converted cupboard, a walk-in cupboard of sorts. And these two persons rent out these rooms in this sort of a apartment or flat block. And how they get to know one another is the old man's window. He has a little window in his cupboard, looks out across the courtyard right into the room of this little old lady and her cupboard. And for some reason, she put a geranium in her windowsill. And this somehow, combined with the beauty, the aged beauty of the lady, inspires the old man to write her letters. They live in the same area, walking distance from one another, but he, probably out of a little bit of shyness and guarding against introducing his dubious character to beauty, writes her letters, and she responds, and they take up this beautiful exchange. The letters, though, are rife with real and intense suffering, with death and disease and poverty and family strife. The old man so loves this lady that he takes a portion of his very small salary each month and buys her bonbons and good paper on which to write her these beautiful letters, and sends her ribbons and all sorts of things that are really not necessary, but at that time was regarded as necessary for women of a certain class. And so the old man works himself back into his drinking problem. Later on, he's dismissed from his post because his clothes are too tattered and the government does no longer want to employ him. He gets sick, she gets sick. It all ends rather sadly as well. And I don't want to give away too much of the story, because I would very much admonish everybody, not encourage everybody to read Dostoevsky and read Poor and Miserable Folk as well. It's a short story. But the point is that in a setting of very real suffering, if you listen to the food that they eat, the struggles of health that they deal with, the very, very few comforts that they have to rely on, the intense relational conflicts that they are embroiled in. If you listen to all of that, it paints a poor and a miserable picture of poor and miserable folk. But throughout all of these letters, you have the beauty of love, just blowing fire into the story, and you really do see quite a lot of light and quite a lot of the best of the human character emerging from what really is terrible, terrible circumstances.
Yeah.
And the story doesn't even have a nice ending. I would say it's got a poor and miserable ending as well. But it remains to be a great story, and one I think that the characters would have been honored to have played a part in.
Because I think they're finding meaning in their suffering somehow this one connection that they have amongst this big turmoil around them is something that is so energizing and exciting, and in spite of everything that's happening around them. And you're a great storyteller, so we're definitely gonna hear more stories from him. But maybe you can talk more about maybe what Dostoevsky meant by that story, or what we could learn from that about suffering.
That's a very good question. And as I'm looking to the fire, I'm thinking of perhaps a more of a prosaic way of expressing it, because we are talking of Dostoevsky here, so it doesn't help giving great abstract answers. Well, I think what Dostoevsky tries to do in this story, as in many of his others, is to show forth something of the fact that from the ashes of life, one can still scrape away embers that can again be kindled into a little fire that gives light and heat to the lives of others and to yourself. And obviously this is inextricable from Dostoevsky's deep-rooted Christian convictions. Existential Christian convictions, and that is something in which I'm sure you can elaborate quite a bit, because I think Dostoevsky, I speak under correction, but I think that he was heavily inspired by Kierkegaard. And where Kierkegaard obviously also was an excellent storyteller to which I was introduced courtesy of Herr Kruger here, and his also laudable, I think that's the correct word, ability of telling stories.
Thanks.
But there's this confluence between the two, and I think Dostoevsky tries to, just by means of novels, illustrate what Kierkegaard tried to do by means of very, very, one could say, complex academic stories or philosophical stories.
That's true.
That have a lot of weight. But
he
over to you.
He also used stories, little stories, short stories, to basically convey some of the most important aspects of the gospel, the good news. And he often didn't end his stories in a good way, just like Dostoevsky. That's, I think, something that's common amongst existentialist writers, because they have this view of life as something that you can't always think of in very optimistic ways.
Ideal terms.
Yeah, exactly. They were one of those thinkers that encourage people to not idealize life too much, because we also have to acknowledge the bad things that happen in life, and even a pessimistic view is maybe necessary for us to actually be realistic. But in any case, I think your story is also a great story about how we also view theology of the cross, Luther's theology of the cross, which is basically that also we're often just surrounded by sinful, chaotic, evil things and events around us,
And within us.
yeah, that just make life a big mess sometimes. And the connections we then have with people are often really deep connections, because they offer us something very special, like a like a star, or a little fire in the darkness. Yeah.
Definitely, Tristan. No, I think you hit the hammer, you hit the nail on the head with that one. And I think what we could learn, so regarding the second question of how do we suffer, what we can learn both from Kierkegaard and from Dostoevsky is to not shy away from the reality, the harsh realities of suffering. Because I don't know if you want to elaborate on it, but Kierkegaard's own life story is rather tragic.
Yeah.
The man did not have it did not have it easy. Dostoevsky, similar case in point. Serious and debilitating tragedies of love. Sometimes, impossible loves that did not work out. Heartbreak, infidelity, sickness, exile, imprisonment, being ostracized from the community, poverty. These men lived hard, real lives, and I think their stories bear witness to Christians who do not play around with suffering, but look it in the eye and still find the grace somehow to look to the cross thereafter.
Exactly.
And so we are slowly building up to Theology of the Cross. I think our next episode on the Makhalachadi Pans will be on that topic. But Tristan, perhaps another word from me, and then I'm going to tap you in. What I like to do as a little exercise, in order to remain in touch with this question of how we suffer, is to sometimes, purposefully look at terrible and, I would say, unimaginable suffering. On YouTube, there are various channels of nurses or psychologists or even journalists that make a point of talking to people that the rest of society very comfortably looks away from. And these are the extreme cases. These are the little children that are born with genetic predispositions that do not allow their skin to bind. So you sit with a little child who for decades has to grow up, become a man, with the inability to move his wrist without his skin tearing and bleeding, and then having to clot. And you have the case of the man in the iron lung who passed away not too long ago, a man whose lung stopped working because of polio, and who had to be put into a tube as an artificial lung and had to be stationary, lying on his back for a good 70 years of his life. You have intense stories of extreme suffering that you often look away from. And I think the sadness of it is we don't hear the beauty and the meaning that there is in these people's lives.
So last year, actually, we were sent to a hospital, basically to practice having conversations with patients or people who need some guidance. And there we definitely also saw many of these terrible conditions that people are in, which are so easy to ignore. But you know, I, for example, visited the diabetes section where they often had to operate people's legs and arms and toes off, and yeah, you just realize how people have this pain, not only of physical pain, but also of losing something of yourself. And in those conversations, I just realized as well, there's always one little thing that keeps them going, and it might not always be something very positive or something that I would see as sustainable. That hope that they have, maybe to see a family member or to go out and travel or something like that. It might not even be realistic, but they have something they have to hold on to, and that just made me realize as well how important it is to preach the good news and to preach how Christ can be that figure that we hold on to. But I think writers like Dostoevsky or Kierkegaard make it very clear that it's not always, preaching the gospel isn't always as easy as just saying Christ died and was raised to life for us so that we may live in eternity, but and that he forgave us, forgave our sins. In this world, somehow we have to find the right language and the right stories to retell this beautiful message, and especially in conversations you realize this, because a person might not necessarily directly think of Christ, or they might not even be able to follow biblical principles because life is just so difficult, but maybe there is something that they are really hopeful for. So this it might actually be art or beautiful music or the sheets that they have or the conversations they have with their family. These, I think, are places where God is definitely present, where he's connecting us with other people. And in the story of Dostoevsky, I see that as well, God connecting people in the most terrible circumstances.
Yes. I love how you've described these simple instances of hope in life. I want to abuse a term of the church fathers. They called it the semina verbi, when referring to those elements in pagan theology that happen to be correct. And I think these also can be semina verbi, seeds of the word, seeds of the gospel, planted in the common ground of our lives. And I think that we theologians really have to get back into constantly train ourselves, exercise ourselves in cultivating those seeds, helping them to grow in the real ground of people's real lives, and not just plaster over with nice biblical stories or the comfortable theological terminology as you've just...
Exactly. Yeah.
But it takes practice.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm just talking from the point of view of someone who has had very minimal experience, but from that little experience and from what I've heard, you find that you need a lot of practice in these conversations, and these stories that we read at least help us a little bit to keep us humble, very humble, and not to think that we can just fix situations that easily. And in situations of suffering, I just want to mention though, I read a few research articles.
This is a thing he's going to say until the very end of the podcast.
But in psychology, there are a few papers I read which basically state they found that the people who actually have some religious hope or religious belief while they're lying on their deathbed maybe, or suffering from an injury, are the ones who actually at the end of that operation or time of suffering have a much better mentality. Basically, they are much more able to carry on, because they have this idea or this belief which they place, or something to hold on to, basically spiritually, and yeah, you just see that in suffering, that's really where you see how meaningful faith is, how important it is.
There's something beyond this terror. There's something beyond this this unbearable burden.
And I mean, you see it in the Bible as well. Take, for example, Book of Lamentations, where it's not written clearly in highlighted words, but they are still at the end of this lamenting and crying out to God, saying they are still crying out to God. They still do believe in God, and that He is the only one who can really, in the end, save them. And you have the John 17 where Christ is obviously also Jesus is praying on behalf of us disciples. Yeah, so many places in the Bible where this trust in God comes out, where you might not even expect it.
Definitely, and I also think that one thing that I often have to caution myself, and I think it applies to theologians generally, but definitely also to the laity, anybody who retains a healthy familiarity with the biblical stories. So often I think we make them prettier than they are. We focus on the nice bits of the story and gloss over those elements that really show us how absolutely terrible the situation being described really was. I think, for instance, of the Book of Lamentation. Yes, we can quickly talk about just, the city was destroyed. There was a siege, the city was destroyed, and the people were taken into exile. But I think we should very often come to a pause and consider for ourselves how it looks when a city is placed under siege, how it looks when women and children are raped and killed and burned to death alive. And I know it's extremely uncomfortable, but I think we have to retain this realistic perspective on the presence of suffering in our lives or in the lives of other people, because if we don't, then I think the story does lose a lot of its weight. If we make it a quick ABC on how to feel better about life not going well.
Yeah, exactly.
Instead of an account of real and terrible suffering, despite of which one still sees hope and deliverance in life.
Yeah, maybe just to close off from my side, in our suffering, I think we can also just find that different part of ourselves that we never knew existed that suddenly comes out. It might not always be a good part of ourselves, but I think those are some of the crucial lessons one might learn in suffering. Is what you are basically made of. Not in a sense that you have to prove yourself, but who you really are in times of suffering. That's a big question for me, and I think, to say it quite clearly, we are someone in Christ. That's all I know.
What an excellent note to end off on.
Yeah. Like, comment, and subscribe.
And see you next time on the Makhalachadi Pans.
Mooi.